Okay, good evening. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. My name's Sarah Cook. I'm the director of UNSW's Institute for Global Development, and it's really my huge pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the second Institute Public Lecture for 2019, entitled, as you see, Building Livelihood Capabilities for Women's Economic Empowerment. And it's really my very special pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce a very close friend, a former colleague, and really all-round superstar, Professor Naila Kabeer. Let me just say, I've been told to say, after this event, we will have drinks, so it's an opportunity to spend a little bit more time chatting and asking questions and networking here. So, as I say, I'm really hugely honored to introduce Naila. She is a professor of gender and development at the London School of Economics, and she has previously had positions as professor of development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London, and also as a professorial fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in England. And I think for anyone, students, scholars, practitioners, policymakers, focused on addressing gender issues and gender issues inequality in development, Naila's work has for at least 2 decades and longer really been central to anybody's reading list, to their consciousness about what it means to think critically from a feminist perspective about development issues and inequalities. Her 1994 book, Reversed Realities, Gender Hierarchies in Development, I think for many of us was really a foundational text around the emergence of a feminist development agenda, an agenda aimed at destabilizing how we thought about gender inequalities and how to empower women, particularly in the developing world. And I think underpinning that volume, but running through much of Naila's work, is a strong feminist critique of the mainstream social sciences, more generally, and particularly as applied in development. Naila has researched and published on various aspects and dimensions of inequality, how these play out within households, labor markets, and the wider economy, as well as on policy issues, including, for example, mainstreaming gender in development policy and social protection as development policy. She is also currently president of the International Association of Feminist Economists. She's been here giving talks at Canberra and Melbourne, and in those talks has also provided a critique of some of the dominant methodological approaches and their limitations in addressing questions of gender inequality in development. And I think I should note that we're very grateful to universities in Canberra who brought Naila to Australia so we could take advantage of her being here and have her presence here tonight. So a very warm welcome to you, Naila. We really look forward to what you have to say on building livelihood capabilities for women's economic empowerment. I just note that we will have time for questions at the end. I think Naila will talk for about 45 minutes. We'll have some time for questions. We will take short questions on Slido. I'm sure you all know how to use it. You have to get the app and download this and sign up and do clever things. But we will also obviously have some interactive questions as well if people haven't got their questions in on Slido. So welcome, Naila.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to all of you at the University of New South Wales. My very first time in your continent, so I'm having a little whirlwind tour of all the universities, but I'm seeing little bits of Australia in between as well. We went to the Sydney Opera House yesterday, so that was iconic. So today I will be talking about livelihood capabilities for women's empowerment. About 20 years ago, I wrote an article about women's empowerment, and it was what you call a slow starter. A few people picked it up, cited it, But over time, as the mainstream development industry has become interested in empowerment, that article has got a fresh lease of life. And suddenly I find that it is being used by people in the World Bank and in UNDP and so on and so forth. So at some levels, of course, people like me are very pleased. You don't want your ideas to be on a shelf somewhere past their use-by date. But on another level, of course, one gets a little concerned when concepts that were developed at the grassroots level by feminist activists working very seriously with structures of power find that an idea has been adopted in the mainstream, because sometimes in that process of transition, that idea loses some of its political edge. And so now we find a lot of people have become very interested in what they are calling women's economic empowerment. And I don't know when it shifted from women's empowerment to economic empowerment, but I know why it shifted. It shifted because there is a great deal of research showing that gender equality in labor force participation, in education, increase the pace of economic growth. And if there's anything to capture the attention of policymakers, it's how do we increase the pace of economic growth. They don't ask enough questions about how do we distribute what comes out of growth, but the pace is always important. And therefore, economic empowerment becomes a shorthand for talking about women in the economy. So I don't have a problem about that, as long as we recognize that women's role in the economy, gender equality in the economy, should not only be judged by what happens in the economy. It should be judged by its repercussions for all spheres of women's lives. And so I think of what people call economic empowerment as economic pathways to empowerment, in the way I think of as political pathways to women's empowerment and social and cultural pathways. So all of these are pathways to a broad set of changes that we call empowerment. And as long as we don't think of economic empowerment as just about economics, that's fine. So one thing I'd like to talk about today is really going back to this idea of empowerment and what it means, and how we might want to distinguish it from some of the ways that we see a lot of the new research agenda talking about it, where you often find people talking about an economically empowered woman, where about 20 years ago they would have talked about an economically active woman. So, that idea of economic activity and economic empowerment is becoming conflated, as though just getting women into the economy is going to empower them, and I have a problem with that. But the second reason second rationale really for this talk is that when we do promote women's participation in the economy and improvements in economic opportunities, even if we do not necessarily empower them in the ways that we might want, there are many beneficial changes that can take place. Expansion of their capabilities, their ability to do things that they have reason to value. So in this talk, which comes out of a larger paper, what I've done is I've tried to look at all the different ways in which policymakers are trying to promote women's livelihood capabilities, their ability and their opportunities in the market, and to try and distinguish those changes that we might call empowerment from those other changes in their capabilities that we have reason to value. Improvements in their standard of living, reduction in poverty, increases in child nutrition. These are all outcomes that we have reason to value, but we may not necessarily think of them as evidence of empowerment. So going back to the definition that I started with, I defined empowerment as the processes by which those people who have been denied the ability to exercise strategic, and the focus is on strategic, forms of choice, voice, and influence in their own lives and in the lives of their community, are able to acquire this choice. So it is about a process of change by which people's ability to exercise agency, voice, and influence is expanded. And so that very simple definition gives rise to what I think of as a very rudimentary, linear model of change, whereby you have access to resources, and you ask, do the resources promote your agency? And through that agency, are you able to achieve the kinds of goals that you have reason to value? So resources and the things you are able to do with it are what we call capabilities. And so we're focusing here on how are people trying to promote women's capabilities and what those capabilities then translate into in terms of their achievements and outcomes. And by agency, which I think is a very important term, because it is what links resources to what you are able to achieve, I mean a number of different dimensions. So agency is often thought of in terms of your ability to enact your goals. But I also think of it as a cognitive capacity, your ability to, what Apudurai calls your capacity to aspire, your capacity to dream, your capacity to think of a future for yourselves, to analyze your own situation. These are cognitive capacities that are a part of empowerment. And also a subjective capability. And for those of us who have been brought up in countries where women are regarded as somehow inferior to men, this subjective capacity is an important one. The process by which you start regarding yourself as of equal worth, as having self-worth and social worth, of having a sense of agency, and so on. So the subjective dimension of agency is a very important part of empowerment. So what I'd like to do is to look at all the various ways in which people have tried to promote women's capabilities, and to ask what has worked, what doesn't seem to have worked in its own terms or in terms of empowerment, and what can we learn from these different interventions, from evaluations of these interventions. And I believe we can learn as much from those that failed as we can from those that succeeded. It's by joining up the dots of failures and successes that we get a much more holistic picture of what these larger problems are. And the interventions that I'm talking about may be promoting women's access to assets of various kinds, land or microfinance. They may be promoting their cognitive capacity, through training and human development, or they may be promoting their access to social resources, connections with each other, associations. But one of the reasons why that very simple model of change that I presented earlier is inadequate is because all of these interventions that have been trying to promote these resources of social, human, and material don't seem to have made much dent. So when we look at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, we find that we have made huge progress on human capabilities, health and education. But these human capabilities were supposed to translate into economic capabilities, into participation in the market and progress in the market. But as you can see, the gap in gender gap in economic participation remains very high at 60%. It's even worse in political participation, but we're not going to touch that in this talk. So just providing people with resources does not necessarily translate into the forms of agency and achievements that we want to see. And so what we need is a theory of the larger structures, what we think of as the patriarchal structures in a society that get in the way of translating resources very simply into agency and achievements. And Nancy Folbrough uses the concept of the structures of constraint. So every society is characterized by a distribution of rules and norms, the official rules, the cultural norms, of resources and of identities. And we are all located in this hierarchy that is created by the structures of constraint, by where we are positioned in this distribution of rules, norms, resources, and identities. So many of us are at the crossroads of poverty, caste, class, and so on. But the structure of constraint is a rather unwieldy concept. How does one unpack it in a way that it becomes recognizable on the ground? And for that purpose, I draw on Anne Whitehead's distinction between two separate sets of constraints. One set of constraints are those that are rooted in the intrinsically gendered domain of family and kinship. When we think of the ideologies of family and kinship, they are intrinsically gendered. They talk about gendered identities of mother, father, son, daughter. I was going to say Holy Ghost, but that's not the one. Mother-in-law, son-in-law. All the language of family and kinship is gendered inherently. And when we speak of a category like mother or a father, we evoke in different cultures what are the expectations associated with those kinds of relationships. So although these are supposed to be domestic ideologies, ideologies of kinship, they are in fact societal ideologies. They are society's definitions of the hegemonic models of masculinity and femininity that we are all supposed to aspire to in a society. And they tell us what is expected of girls and boys, men and women, and one could go on of all the other different identities that come into play. Some of these expectations seem to be similar across the world. One such expectation is that women and girls are given disproportionate responsibility for the unpaid care of looking after the family, of unpaid domestic responsibilities, while men are expected to be the primary breadwinners. So we see that in much of the world, I assume in Australia to some extent as well, and it explains why, by and large, male labor force participation in the economy is higher than that of women. Where we see a variation is in the extent to which societies expect women to participate in breadwinning as well. So in the culture that I come from, in South Asia and the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, there are powerful ideological norms and rules that women should remain confined to reproductive responsibilities. And there are powerful controls over their mobility in the public domain. So MENA and South Asia still have the lowest female labor force participation in the world. Elsewhere, in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, women also are expected to contribute to breadwinning. And they are given resources to run their own enterprises, trade, farming, and so on. And there, the gender gap in labor force participation is much smaller. So, at one broad level, these so-called domestic ideologies prescribe what men and women should be doing. They prescribe how they should feel, their aptitudes, their skills. And these are, of course, socially constructed, but they become internalized because that is what you grow up with. In a particular, I find it quite amusing that in South Asia, it's always men who do the trading because they're supposed to have a head for money. But in Philippines, for instance, women are supposed to do the trading because they're just interested in all the grubby stuff around money, and men are too high-minded, to be thinking about trade. So each culture has its own way of prescribing what are the gender norms in that particular society. And of course, technology. We have these strong taboos in South Asia about touching the plow and the weaver's loom. And in Africa, the hoe is a technology associated with women. So one can see how the broader economy starts to get stratified by gender according to some of these domestic ideologies, which are truly societal ideologies. But there is another set of constraints which explain why these gendered domestic ideologies are so powerful. And those are the constraints that operate through the relations of supposedly neutral institutions of states, markets, and civil society. So in textbooks, states are supposed to be neutral. But in reality, as the World Bank and the International Financial Corporation has seen, there are countries across the world that reproduce in their laws the unequal norms of the domestic domain, reproduce unequal inheritance laws, reproduce norms through their laws that women have to ask permission to open up a bank account, to start up their own businesses, and to travel. So across the world, we find that states reproduce through their laws those inequalities that prevail in the domestic domain. Sometimes it is very unconscious because we all grow up with these prejudices and stereotypes. And my favorite example comes from India, where the municipality of Delhi had to admit to the High Court of Delhi that they had produced over 3,000 toilets in streets for men, public toilets, and less than 300 for women. And you can imagine that nobody got up one day and said, oh, we'll give men 3,000 and women 300. It's just who they saw were on the streets. So it's this kind of unconscious bias, but it has profound implications for women street vendors who suffer a very high rate of kidney problems because there's just simply not enough toilets. And we see these norms being reproduced through trade unions who tend to recognize only bread and butter issues like wages as important for women workers rather than issues like sexual harassment, safety on the streets, childcare, and so on. So through many different pathways, we see these structures of constraint being reproduced. And there are a number of other points I'd like to make on that. One is about feedback mechanisms, that not all of the discriminations that we see are deliberate. So for instance, if markets discriminate against women in terms of jobs and wages, then it makes sense for parents to invest in boys rather than in girls. It's not deliberate discrimination on their part, it's a rational response to the structures of constraint. So when agro-processing firms come to Africa, it makes sense for them to give the contracts to male farmers, because female farmers don't have land, they're not able to mobilize family labor in the same way. So there's a kind of a feedback mechanism also that keeps these things rolling along. And finally, of course, and very importantly, gender does not exist in isolation. I'm talking in terms of categories at the moment as a shorthand. But we all know and we all recognize that gender is embedded in relations of class, caste, indigeneity, legal status, and so on. So we can never analyze what's going on in society without disaggregating these categories of men and women. And we see that, for instance, in the informal economy, across the developing world, most men and women from poorer households are in the informal economy, are in informal forms of self-employment. But even amongst the very poorest, women are more likely to be found in unpaid family labor, where they have no independent access to income, and men are more likely to be found in own-account work, where they do have some kind of access to profits. And of course, one other thing that we need to bear in mind is about life course. That gender gap in labor force participation is largest in the women's reproductive years, because that is when, in the prime productive years of people's lives, it's also the prime reproductive. And a lot of the constraints that women experience are related to marriage and children and so on. So there's a life course element. So when we start talking about theories of change, we have to complicate that very basic linear three-dimensional model. We have to remember that all interventions are located and underpinned by these overarching structures of constraint. And therefore, we have to constantly ask questions. We cannot take things for granted. One set of questions we have to ask is, did the interventions that you provided, did they actually translate into resources? Interventions are supposed to deliver education, deliver land, deliver microfinance. Did they do that? We can't take that for granted. Secondly, if they managed to deliver resources, did those resources translate into forms of agency? Did they enhance women's capabilities? That too is a matter for empirical investigation. Simply providing women with microfinance is not going to turn them into entrepreneurs. And finally, if it did translate into forms of agency, how did women exercise their agency and what kind of achievements were they able to report? And here we want to make that distinction I mentioned earlier between practical achievements, enhancing family standard of living, sending your children to school. All of these are important practical achievements, but they are still within the domestic ideologies of gender. What we also want to ask is, did these forms of agency, allow women at least to start questioning the structures of constraint? They may not have started to challenge them, but did they start to question them? Were their cognitive capabilities enhanced to the extent that they start to say, this is not just, this is not fair? That is the beginning of empowerment, when you start questioning the injustice of the arrangements that you've been grown up with. So I make a distinction there between practical outcomes, which reinforce or remain accommodated by the existing structures of constraint, and strategic outcomes, which are the ones that start to question, to challenge, to subvert, and perhaps to transform. So moving on to some of the interventions, I shall go through them very rapidly, but I found it very fascinating, and I was asked to do this by the Overseas Development Institute as a part of their GAGE program. And I found it a really wonderful opportunity to read through this mass of literature we have today of evaluating, assessing interventions, okay? And so I wanted to divide them into the ones that encountered roadblocks to change. So, starting the first question, do interventions translate into resources? Well, not always. For instance, in the 1970s, Esther Bose wrote a book that said that government extension services, government support for agriculture continuously bypassed women farmers because it was assumed by Western-trained planners that all farmers were men. In the 1990s, Sato et al. Found that agriculture extension services continuously bypassed women farmers because it was assumed that all farmers were men. In 2014, IFPRI has brought out a new review of the literature, and guess what? Agricultural extension services continue to bypass women farmers. You know, it's like 14% and 78% in Malawi. And why is that? Because the image that people have in their heads of farmers is male. The image that people have in their heads of farming is what men do. So, homestead cultivation, post-harvest processing of crops, rearing cattle, all of these things very often are not counted as agriculture. And this is what women do. So systematically we see agricultural extensions continue to bypass women. But that is a resource that women farmers need and want. And in the 70s, when Kathleen Stow did an article, she found that although agricultural extension services bypassed female farmers, female heads of households, they still managed to adopt new crops, new seeds, because they use their own networks to find out about the information that was being. So it is not that they don't want it. But a second way in which interventions fail is by offering something that nobody wants. And here we have a very interesting set of randomized control trials, which set out to, prove the stuff on microfinance. And they did 6 or 5 RC randomized control trials of microfinance in urban India, Morocco, Ethiopia, Mexico, and Mongolia. And they came to the conclusion, well, the impacts are modest but promising. Actually, between 18 and 25% of people who were offered microfinance took it up. So when you're talking about impacts are promising, you're talking about that 18 or 20% that took up microfinance. What about the 80% that didn't? The reason is, although a lot of this was being offered to women, in some cases to men and women, there was no demand for microfinance. In urban Hyderabad, it's wage labor. In Morocco and Ethiopia, rural, remote, where is the enterprise opportunities? In Mexico, borderland Mexico, violence, drugs, who's going to start up businesses? So you think to yourself, well, it didn't have modest impacts. It just had impacts for the 20% who took it. But, so it didn't translate into resources because nobody wanted it. And you didn't do your homework to find out what people actually needed in those areas. So moving on, when you do manage to provide resources that people desire, what prevents them from translating into capabilities, into enhanced livelihood agency? Well, classic is the initial, if you're looking at men and women, the initial inequalities in assets and capabilities. So everywhere that you're offering, let us say, agricultural extension services or other, forms of interventions, women are never able to take full advantage because they have poorer land, less land. They don't have access to the kinds of labor that you need. So they may have access to child labor or elderly labor, whereas men have access to adult labor. So one problem is initial conditions, that men and women start out from a very different position. And therefore, you constantly find this depressing finding, male productivity went up by this much % higher than female, and yeah, guess why? Secondly is what we talked about earlier. Women have prior responsibilities to the family. And it is only after they have finished their responsibilities to the family that they can then go and perhaps look on their farms and so on. So a World Bank study for the first time recently looked at the differences between male and female and why female productivity in farms is lower than that of men. And of course, it found poorer land, et cetera, et cetera. But for the first time, it factored in numbers of children in the household. And numbers of the children in the household actually affects the productivity gap between men and women. The more children there are, the less time women have on their farms and the less productive they are. Then we talked about constraints on mobility that are not just about childcare and domestic work, but about culture. And in Pakistan, for instance, you gave the same kinds of microfinance to male and female entrepreneurs in the rural areas. Men reported higher profits. Why? Because women could spend far less time in their enterprises than men could. Very simple. So, and women also their enterprises tended to be based at home, whereas male customers, men were interacting with the broader markets. A very interesting study from Sri Lanka. Again, a randomized control trial. You're offering people working capital and cash transfers, small-scale entrepreneurs, male and female. Men report 9% increase in income, women report 0. And it kind of depresses you, thinking, what are these bloody women, not doing anything with these transfers? But then you start looking at what's going on, and you find that men and women are very stratified into different activities. And the activities into which men are stratified have higher returns than those of women. And the activities in which women are stratified are mainly at home. And their customers are from much nearer than those of men. And finally, both men and women have very strong views about what is culturally appropriate. So it is not considered culturally appropriate for women to do bicycle repairs, which is very profitable. And it's not considered appropriate for men to do lace making, which is not that profitable. So cultural norms continue to channel people into these different kinds of activities. And time and mobility constraints means you offer men and women training, and guess what? Women can't attend because they have childcare responsibilities, they have further to go, and so on. Intra-household power dynamics, I'll skip through that one. We know what it means. But for one thing that you should know about is that very often men use violence to prevent women from going into forms of work that they don't approve of, which is mainly work outside the home. So whether it's Tanzania, Morocco, Bangladesh, we've met women often face a great deal of resistance for moving too far away from home. But the more interesting, illuminating example of intra-household power dynamics comes from Uganda. Once again, you're offering cash transfers to entrepreneurs. Men, on the whole, report higher profits than women. We are no longer surprised. But amongst men, those who lived with their families or near their families reported higher profits than those men that were far away. Because those men who lived near their families could use family labor as unpaid family labor in their enterprises, right? Then those men who did. But amongst women, those women who live with their families reported lower profits. Not only did they have to look after the family, but their profits were often used to finance and to spend on the rest of the family. So these power dynamics also get in the way of who has access to whose labor, who can appropriate whose profits, who makes decisions about whose enterprise. I'll forget codes of conduct. And then the final one is about holes in the opportunity structures. We talked earlier about microfinance, offering microfinance to people who don't need it. Well, there was attempts to train young women in Haiti in, vocational training for employment. There were no jobs. There were no jobs for them to go to. This is a very depressed labor market. Women are either doing unpaid family labor or very poorly paid self-employment. And those women who did find out about job opportunities and managed to get some kind of, opening, had to face sexual harassment, even to get a job interview. So it left them feeling very demoralized. The training helped them to push back, but it left them feeling very demoralized about the possibilities of them translating their capabilities into real job opportunities. So let's go to the slightly more positive set of lessons. So we talked earlier about those randomized control trials in these different countries. It's a highly widely cited study. But it's interesting that it hardly mentions a 21% take-up. It kind of glosses over that. But there are other kinds of microfinance initiatives that are far more positive. And these are ones that have been around for a long time. They have learned, they have adapted, they have adjusted, they have found out what works and what doesn't work. We have two kinds of microfinance organizations for women. Both of them focus on groups. We have the famous Grameen Bank and Joint Liability Group, where you have small groups of women who meet on a regular basis and must stand collateral for each other's loans. So that is a credit-driven model. And in India, you have the self-help groups who come together, again, 20 women or 30 women, agree that they are going to save a certain amount of money every month, and then they will lend to each other and pay an interest rate and schedule and it's quite flexible. So it's a savings-led approach. Now, when we look at the evaluations of these programs, we find somewhat more positive outcomes. So 20 years of evaluation of the same 3 or 4 microfinance joint liability approaches in Bangladesh has found that microfinance for women has a much greater impact than for men. So loans to women are much more likely to lead to assets in women's names, children's education, closing of the gender gap in education, which I regard as empowering, and so on. But over 20 years, some of these impacts became weaker as markets became saturated. So there is a limit to how much microfinance can achieve unless you diversify opportunity structures. Most of the ones on joint liability groups tend to focus on intra-household impacts, on economics and so on. The self-help group programs tend to, over the years, use self-help groups not only to, provide savings, to link up to government poverty banking, but also as a platform for collective action. So when we find evaluations of self-help groups, they look at a much broader range of impacts. So they look for, stability of income in times of crisis. They look at all the kind of other conventional economic things. But they also ask questions about household decision-making. They ask, do self-help groups engage in collective action? Do they engage with local officials? Do they take part in political activity? And we find a much more positive set of outcomes. So when we contrast these RCTs that go in for 1 year or 2 years and find hardly any impact or take-up, with these long-established institutions, a lesson comes out. There are no shortcuts. There is no shortcut to women's empowerment. You have to be there for the long duration. You have to learn about what works, and you have to adapt. So the organization I work with in India, Pradhan, began out with self-help groups for financial services. Over the years, it became livelihoods training, and more recently, it has been about women's political economic empowerment. But it's been in the field for 25 or 30 years, and therefore we can expect to see these kinds of impacts. This sounds like a no-brainer, but designing training in ways that address women's needs and constraints works better than designing training that does not. So, for instance, when you provide women with stipends for transport or for childcare, women are much more likely to participate in training. When you design training training manuals that are written in simple languages in Kenya, women are much more likely to take up the messages that are in that training. When you design training in ways that address the precise needs of the market, you are likely to be far more successful. A very good example of that comes from Togo, a randomized control trial from Togo, which experimented with 2 kinds of approaches, internationally accredited business approach, and then an approach on building initial initiative. So one was about, what you need to be a businesswoman, and the other is, how do you think like a businesswoman? How do you learn to plan? How do you learn to take risks? And surprisingly, while neither program had much impact on survival of businesses, those that survived, the individual initiative program, the one that, went into mindsets and motivations, was far more successful than the standard business model. Now, if we can multiply that, if we can replicate it, if we can scale it up, it's telling us that you start with cognitive capacity, not with transfer of knowledge. You start with people's subjective views of what they can and cannot do, not with just, giving them a bit of information about businesses and so on. Who is doing the training? In India, Self-help, the NGOs are much better trainers than bank officials, not surprisingly. In Tanzania, long experienced university trainers trained up the staff of an NGO. But at least in the short run, they found that the long experienced trainers had much, higher participation rates and better outcomes than the recently trained. So who is doing the training also matters. And one of the reasons I harp on about this is when you look at this literature, people just say training. Training. It's like there's a generic thing called training that you then deliver. But who is doing the training? How long for? What intensity? What is the content? And how much does it match with what is required? So in Nepal, for instance, training for young women and men, women were more likely to find jobs than men because they were being trained in two areas for which there was high demand: beauticians and hairdressing, I think it was. The men who did find jobs was in computer training. So again, designing your training to see what the market needs rather than what you think women should do is also, quite an important step. When we go to, how long have I got? 5 minutes. People always say 5 minutes when you say, how long have I got? Okay, when we go back to that earlier point I made about the initial conditions, right? That you start out with gender inequalities in assets and human capabilities. One thing that suggests itself is, can we design programs that take account of these inequalities in initial conditions? And I can think of two programs that try to do that. One is from Bangladesh, and it's the BRAC Asset Transfer Program. And it's for the very poorest. And it offers livelihood assets like goats and chickens and whatever. But along with that, it's trying to get women and their families out of extreme poverty in 2 years. Ambitious. But out of extreme poverty, not out of poverty, right? You're still in moderate poverty, but you're out of extreme poverty. But it matches, it combines asset transfers with a consumption stipend over that entire period so that you don't have to go doing wage labor and neglect the assets that you've been given. It provides them with access to health care because health is a big shock for poor people to become poorer. It provides them with training on how to look after their assets, and it provides them with intensive mentoring. And that means BRAC staff come and visit them on a weekly basis, discuss their problems, talk about the future, and that intensive mentoring is, I think, the key. It is the key. Because the BRAC program was quite successful. It's been replicated all across the world in various randomized control trials. On the whole, it's quite positive, but impacts are uneven. And the impacts are most uneven when it comes to women's empowerment as measured by decision-making. But we evaluated one of these pilots in West Bengal. And in the West Bengal pilot, they added a self-help group component. And we did that evaluation in 2011. It was very successful. Some women didn't do very well, but we interviewed 20, but at least 11 did very, very well, and we're very happy. We've just gone and revisited them in 2018. And the thing that they keep telling you that they remember is what in Bengali we say buddhi and gyan, ideas and knowledge and thinking. So the lasting impact was for these very poor tribal women who never thought ahead, and it's not patronizing to say that, they don't think ahead, they cannot think about the future. The idea of diversifying their livelihoods, the idea of buying rice when it's cheap so that they can afford to eat when the price of rice goes, all of these ideas, some of their assets died, goats and chickens died, but the ideas remained, and the ones that have stayed successful have built on those kinds of ideas. So it's that multi-stranded approach that takes care of these inequalities, initial inequalities. And the other one that has been very successful on that is India's Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is currently, I think, being starved of resources. But here was a public works program. Public works have traditionally benefited men, but this one had a 30% quota for women, but about 50% of its participants were women. It gave you a job as long as a certain number of people asked for it. It guaranteed you a job of 100 days. It never gives you a job for 100 days. But the job had to be very close to your home. If more than 5 women applied for a job, there had to be a creche. You had to pay minimum wages, and the wages had to be equal. And not only, as I said, about 50% of the participants of the NREGS were women, but agricultural wages went up in a number of areas to the great, the landlords were not very happy. But agricultural wages in India and in the rest of the world are amongst the lowest. So if you do something to get agricultural wages up, it's not a bad thing. And women said, who were interviewed, that actually working for a government program, even if it is providing physical labor, whatever, gives them some sort of protection that working for private landlords and private contractors does not do. It gives them some sort of protection from harassment, cheating, and so on. I'm not going to idealize that program, it has its faults. But given that all programs have their faults, this one, I think, can be held up as a very genuine attempt to address the kinds of inequalities that we were talking about. I'm going to skip those last two and just go to my final semi-final slide. All that I've been discussing so far are for intended beneficiaries. These are projects, time-bound, limited number. We are really talking about changing structures. So what is also useful to look at are there interventions that go beyond that are not intended for beneficiaries, that are intended to have larger impacts, across society. And here, extremely important, and it came up in the Commission for the Status of Women this year, infrastructure and utilities. Roads, electricity, mobile phones, all of these things for people who are particularly immobile, who particularly have severe time constraints, electricity, running water, roads, all of these things help to connect people up with opportunities and have a particularly strong impact for women. Group-based approaches, invaluable, whether the groups are for, instrumental reasons, getting your goods to the market, or as in the self-help groups and others, about mobilizing for, policy change, etc. The essence of building women into groups who are otherwise isolated is, I think, one of the key lessons that has come out of the literature. The state, as we saw, can be an enemy of women. The state can also be its friend, be their friends. So we have examples of, minimum wage in South Africa, huge benefit to domestic workers who otherwise were being paid very badly. In Argentina, they decided to legalize part-time work, and that allowed a lot of married women to go into formal work in the market. In Brazil, the use of minimum wage has upped the overall wages in the economy and closed the gender gap. Simplifying the regulations, the hoops you have to go to register your enterprise so you can formalize, that too has a particularly powerful impact on women. So in Vietnam, reducing the number of days needed to register your enterprise from 90 to 7 led to a huge increase in formal registration by women. And one can tell, in Morocco or Ethiopia, family law, changing family law, not requiring women to have to ask permission from guardians and so on, also increased the number of young unmarried women going into decent forms of work, into formal kinds of work. But all of these come up against that binding constraint, which is the lack of economic opportunities. Why are we focusing on enterprise so much? Because there are no waged opportunities. Because the growth that we have seen in the last few decades have not generated jobs. And so we turn to people to make up their own jobs as they go along. That's what enterprise is about. And I think more and more economists in the mainstream, the IMF, et cetera, are beginning to recognize that a growth-centered macroeconomic policy that is not capable of generating employment is a part of the story of inequality that we are seeing today. And so I think all of us really need to coordinate and mobilize to make sure that we start to shift the direction of macroeconomic policies in a way that generates jobs, not self-invented bits of work, but jobs. And finally, as I said, that was my semi-final, my concluding reflections. What are we measuring when we measure impact? Please don't say that just because a woman has a job that she is empowered. We need to take the concept of empowerment seriously, because the concept of empowerment is a reflection of patriarchy and patriarchal structures of constraint. And if those jobs do not allow women to challenge patriarchy in any way, they are not empowering jobs. too many randomized controlled trials, and I think you're going to get a lot more in Australia too. I can see it coming. And really, I'm not against them, but if they cannot tell us how change happens, they are useless. You know, if all they can say is something worked without knowing how it worked, under what circumstances, and who it worked for, they're not particularly useful. So randomized controlled trials, fine, you know, they have all these claims of rigor, but without a history, a context, and qualitative understanding of the mechanisms by which change happens, I think it's very dangerous. I think it's a waste of public money. So I know that there's going to be a conference in Australia quite soon because policymakers are more and more interested, and there's a kind of a bandwagon effect. You know, everybody is jumping on the RCT bandwagon. But there is an article out, if you would like to Google it. It's by Isabel Guerin, Guerrin. And she, remember I told you about the microfinance, Morocco, etc.? She was a part of the RCT in Morocco. And she is able to give you the background story of how you arrive at the results that you want. And so I can't give you the exact reference, but Google it. And an article that I'm doing is going to come out in May, which also looks at the information that's suppressed in a lot of RCTs. In a way, because what they want is to give you a simple answer. And what we want is to say, actually, things are quite complex, and no policymaker really wants to hear that. And finally, what is missing from this economic empowerment agenda? I mentioned those girls in Haiti who couldn't get jobs and only got harassment. The issue of sexual harassment is not just a part of the Me Too movement. It comes up again and again in the literature when you are aware of it. There is data from India. There's a large-scale census data from India that shows that in those districts where there's a high reporting of perceived harassment, women's labor force participation is much lower. There is data from across South Asia and other parts of the world that girls' capabilities, their ability to go to school, to stay at school, to go on to college. In Bangladesh, right now, a young girl from a madrasa has been burnt to death because she complained about the head of her madrasa who harassed her. So, you know, this business of girls' capabilities, this curfew on women, because after a certain time of the day, you're not supposed to go out. After the rape of the woman on the 16th of December in Delhi, the IT industry suffered hugely because no women wanted to do the night shift. You know, transport is not safe. So I think we need to get that issue of sexual harassment. We've talked a lot about domestic violence, but we're not talking here just about domestic violence. We're talking here about the harassments that prevent girls from going to school, women from going to college, and older women or adult women from going out to work. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Naila. And I'm sorry I sort of lost track of time as well because I was so engrossed. I think we've had this huge sweep of so much of the literature and some really provocative questions and issues. So I think there are some Slido questions coming up. I'll just ask I guess people have also, well, I can read them out to you. But yes, you can stand up and walk around. There's a thing there. So the first one, often research does not equal meaningful change. How do we encourage multilateral transdisciplinary approaches to ensure impactful TOCs?
Is that theory of change?
Theory of change, okay. And
well, let me just...
do you want to talk about the first one? I also want to see if there are other people with individual questions. So why don't you take the first one?
Okay.
There, if you have an immediate response.
Well, actually, I think I tried to answer the first one in my closing comments, and that is, you know, I understand that policymakers don't have a lot of time to read. Everything has to be in bullet points. I understand that their heart sinks when we say context matters, because really they want something, you know, context-less. But if you think of public money, if you think of taxpayers' money, then why are we not trying to invest in understanding change before we try to make it happen? And so for me, interdisciplinarity, methodological plurality, and a place for RCTs. You know, I'm not dismissing RCTs. I think it's bringing different methodologies and the insights of different disciplines together, which will make for the kind of understanding a theory of change, rather than assuming it from the outset.
We've had more questions coming up as you speak, so maybe we should follow these. Any strategies to overcome domestic ideologies of gender? Again, I think you talked a little bit.
Yes, I think a lot of opening up men and women to alternative ways of thinking. I think the media can be hugely important. School education can be hugely important. What we start learning in school is hugely important. And the purposive training efforts to get people to reflect on what they take for granted and to start questioning what they take for granted. And people often say that, feminists, you're just anti-culture. But, culture is not a package. It's stranded, it's multi-stranded. And some of those strands you want to pull out, and get rid of. But there's a great deal of all our cultures that we want to hold on to. Nobody wants to kind of become somebody else. But when you give women a voice, or when you give children a voice, you start to realize that, that culture that everybody seems to want to defend has not always been on their side. And you've only been able to continue defending it because you've never allowed them to voice their objections to it.
The next one. Is there evidence to show that tackling gender-based violence facilitates resource capability pathway?
Evidence to show. Well, I would sort of take that for granted, that the existence of gender-based violence, the examples that I've given of, the kinds of jobs. I'll give you an example from Bangladesh. There are a whole number of jobs that women will not do because it exposes them to the likelihood of gender-based violence. So it's almost in the negative, that you don't do certain things because you know that it's going to expose you to this kind of violence. I can't think offhand of a study that said we reduced gender-based violence and therefore, people were able to do certain things. The only one I can tell you about is work done by my colleagues at SOAS, who looked at Mozambique, and they found that the best paid jobs for women were on large farms, multinational farms, big farms. But only widows and divorced women could do those jobs. And their assumption was that married women were prevented from doing those jobs by their husbands, precisely because these were some of the better paid jobs. So that's as close as I get to a direct answer to that question. How does women economic reduce dowry practice and violence? Well, it hasn't, has it? Dowry has continued to go up. It's rising. And it is impoverishing, because it's the daughters, the parents of daughters that have to pay the dowry. And they don't have sons to offset the costs, then they are impoverished. So I think the only way one can tackle the issue of dowry is through, governments have spoken out against it, and it hasn't done much good. I think it has to be done on a collective basis. Some kind of, collective movement, group-based movement, and so on, that takes it on as, for what it is, a tax on parents who have daughters. But I see it going up, and I don't see any signs that it has abated. There was a time when I thought that a lot of the women who joined the garment industry in Bangladesh, they did not pay dowry. Dowry is interestingly absent in so-called love marriages. Maybe we should encourage more love marriages. Yes, because dowry is paid by parents as a part of an arranged marriage. I'm thinking aloud, I don't know if I have any answers, but it is the case that love marriages don't often have dowries.
And a final question here, and then I'll see if there's any.
Okay. How do you conceptualize agency that empowers? Often when we try to capture their voices, they want to stay at home and do the domestic chores. Well, you know, there's an interesting issue of voice, and that is we want to hear from women, and we want to hear from women in oppressed groups, in marginalized groups, etc. And the very first thing that they will always say is that they want to stay at home and look after the kids. And the very first thing they will say that is because the options outside are not particularly appealing. You know, part of the harassment that we've talked about and so on. But there are a number of things to bear in mind. One is people express the aspirations that they know, the aspirations that their society approves of. If you don't open up the possibilities of other ways of living your life, why would they express any other view? And secondly, and this is, it is contested, but from a lot of the world, we find that women who stay at home and don't do any kind of income-generating work very often exercise the least say in decision-making and so on, unless they have sons in a son-preferential household. They are also the ones who are likely to be poorest in their old age because, they will never have worked, they will not have any assets in their own names, they will not have, pensions. So a lot of those people who are poor in their old age is because they spent their lives devoted to their families, but never built anything up for themselves. If they're fortunate, their children will look after them, but many are not. And we do know that poverty is higher amongst women than men in old age. And that's why this whole issue of social pensions. So it's also, I kind of want to say to people, think of your future. You really do need to do a little bit of, building up something for your own future so that you don't have to depend on other people when you get old.
Well, we've got a couple of questions directly from the audience, so we'll take one here.
Just wondering if you had any suggestions for what sort of questions or processes we should be looking into at the design and planning stages and sort of consultation stages to ensure that we are designing projects or interventions that can address that structural outcome as well that leads to the changes in the kind of strategic constraints.
Well, I think it's part of the questions, but it's also looking at histories and it's looking at the existing body of research and using that to frame questions. Because I think just going straight to people and asking questions, you're not going to get answers. And I think another thing that I have a gripe about RCTs is they don't read the secondary literature of the places that they go to. So they design their questions as context-free. So I think really studying a particular area, understanding what the nature of patriarchy is, understanding where the weak points might be, understanding whether it's important to bring men in from the very beginning or whether you might want to bring them at a later stage. I think all of these things can be done through deep immersion in the existing literature and then through, consultations and discussions with various people.